Especially if it's young and full of high odor alcohols.
Yeah, exactly. Or a big red Zin that's, like almost 15% alcohol. But the thing is, it's actually not the sulfites that cause it, and it doesn't make sense because red wine on average actually has less sulfites than white wine. So if somebody says, I'm going to drink white wine to not get a headache because of the sulfites, you're actually getting more sulfites in the white wine. They think that it's from maybe histamines or tyramines or some of these other things, but they don't actually know why people get red wine headaches, but they do know that it's not from the sulfites. Like apricots can have 1,000 parts per million or even up to 3,000 parts per million, and people eat dried apricots. So, and other dried foods too, like potatoes, like French fries and some of the other potatoes. If you pre-cut them and then freeze them, they have to put sulfites on there because otherwise they'll turn brown and look really yucky. So a lot of those foods have a lot more sulfites, many times more than does wine or mead. Now, some people do have a sulfite, what they call a sulfite allergy, where they actually get a reaction, and it's usually like an asthmatic reaction, and it's typically in a person who already has pre-existing asthma. But I just before we did this podcast, I actually went back and reviewed the medical literature, and very, very few cases have been reported since the 1980s. And it turns out it's really rare, less than 1% of the population. But what was happening back in the 70s and 80s is there were people getting severe reactions because in fresh food, it was in salad bars, they were spraying the salad with sulfite spray to try to keep it looking fresh and crisp and not turning brown. And it was some worker, I'll do it in another 10 minutes. There wasn't really regulated. And that's where some people got really, really sick. And so that's where the FDA banned sulfites in fresh fruits and vegetables. And then all prepackaged foods and beverages that contain sulfites, they have to say that. And that's why even if you make a wine or a mead and you're a commercial, you can't really, you can say it contains no added sulfites, but unless you actually test it and prove that it has no sulfites in there, even naturally from the yeast, you can't actually say it contains no sulfites unless you've proven that. But they haven't had any reports now, like with the newer levels that have been severely limited. So, not to say that there isn't somebody who might be sensitive, but they'll know. I mean, they certainly wouldn't be eating any of the fruits or any dried fruits or any things that have it in it either. So one of the things I ran into when I was trying to make mead without sulfites is you try to prevent it from turning into vinegar. I mean, that's the natural state where wine wants to go. There's sugar, and then the yeast has its activity, and then you have alcohol made and some other compounds, and then the next step is it goes to acetaldehyde, which in a small amount might be pleasant. I mean, that's kind of what you get in a sherry or something like that. It might not be what you want, though, if you have this fresh, fruity melomel, that you're really trying to have a fresh character. But then that's going to go over to volatile acidities, so acetic acid and then ethyl acetate, which is like the nail polish remover smell. And some of the ways that you might try to make mead without sulfites is you need to be very careful with sanitation. If they're extremely careful, because there's any bacteria in there, it's going to sit there and be ready to affect your mead later on because you're not using any sulfites. Because the yeast that we use, the selected strains, they're fairly resistant to sulfite compared to the wild yeasts and bacteria. And so that's why a winemaker who's pressing grapes will use sulfites up front on the must to kill off any wild yeast, and then they can put their strain in there. But as the yeast is no longer having effect, that's where you could get some of the bacteria taking over later. You might want to be very careful to avoid oxidation, so you might put CO2 over your mead, but even that's not enough because even acetobacter, I can't remember, I think it was a very small amount of oxygen it needed, like 1 part per million or something, really tiny amount of oxygen for it to survive. So covering your tank with or your carbo with carbon dioxide bled off from a tank, that still might not be enough. Higher alcohol meads tend to do better if they're not sulfited, so higher alcohol can be somewhat protective, but you can still have oxidation. And the acetaldehyde, like I said, that might be pleasant if it's in a limited amount, but it can get to a point. And then if you have the oxidation that's more like the wet cardboard, obviously that's kind of not very good.
And so Tom,
I guess another... Yeah, interrupt. Do you have any questions about anything I just said?
I'm sorry. I wanted to double check to make sure that our readers are understanding correctly. Even if you practice as good of hygiene as you can in your process, by not sulfiting, you're still leaving yourself open for these maladies, right?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And, like to make a vinegar, you need like acetobacter, but you can have some acetic acid forming simply from oxidation, and it's not going to be a vinegar, but it's going to be that flaw. And, when you're tasting it, it might not even smell like vinegar. It might just be more of a burn or a harshness, and that's from both the ethyl acetate and the acetic acid. That's just chemically being converted from the acetaldehyde. So one of the other things I've been told is, I've read in the forums, is that, mead cannot oxidize because honey does not oxidize. It's impossible for traditional mead to oxidize. And that's not true, exactly. So, honey does have antimicrobial effects, and they're even studying this, it's in the medical literature, mostly for applying to wounds, which is actually pretty cool. There was a study when I was a fellow in Madison, Wisconsin, that they looked at like diabetic foot ulcers. I mean, a diabetic, you're worried about their blood sugar, and they're putting honey on their foot ulcer. I mean, that's kind of crazy, but it actually worked. It decreased increased the time, or just decreased the time of healing. So that's pretty cool. But that's when it's honey and it's not diluted. Once you're diluted, I mean, yeast can ferment it, so anything else can grow in it also. And so there's two types of oxidation. You've got the type that causes browning from, like in a wine, you have a red wine and now it's aged. It might be, instead of a brilliant red, it's more of a browning. And in a limited amount, that might be okay, like a really good old wine, but you don't want that in something young where you get that, and that's called enzymatic browning. So that's the polyphenols are changing. But any alcoholic beverage can have the chemical or non-enzymatic oxidation, and that's making the ethanol into the acetaldehyde, like I just said. And that can be in a traditional mead. So when they say, you cannot have oxidation of a traditional mead because there's no fruit juice in it, well, that's not true. You certainly can, and we've judged a few over time.
Mm-hmm.
So sulfites and sulfides.
I've got one that's absolutely terrible.
Yeah. So you can have oxidation. And the thing is, when you're making wine or mead, and that's one of the things I didn't know about too much until I started studying wine, is that there's different styles of winemaking, and it's not really, it's either or, and it's not, but they talk about oxidative style of winemaking versus reductive style of winemaking. And I'm not a chemist, but basically the difference is in oxidative style of wine, you're going to allow more oxygen. You might have micro-oxygenation while it's aging. And, the classic example of that would be like a sherry or something like that. And maybe a less so would be like a barrel-aged red, where there will be some more oxidation. And some of these wines will have a little bit more of the volatile acidity, but not enough to be offensive. Whereas the reductive is kind of on the other side of that, where you're trying to keep those wines or those meads very fresh, very crisp, and you're trying to minimize oxidation. So they're going to be having higher levels of sulfiting. They're not going to be barrel-aged. They're going to be in a stainless steel tank, and it's going to be a closed-top tank instead of an open-top tank. But with each of those, you can go too far. So you can go all the way to the oxidative side where it's oxidized and ruined, or reductive, like Ryan had mentioned, some of these reductive faults, like it can be really stinky, hydrogen sulfide or dimethyl sulfide. I've actually got a piment that I kind of ignored, and I tried it the other day, and I'm like, it smells like stinky gym socks. That's not so good. It's very subtle, but I can pick it up in my own stuff, and I know what to do with it. I think it's not too bad, and I'll probably be able to fix it. But I already detected it enough, and I'm pretty self-critical about what I make anyway. But that would be like going all the way to the other side. So it's not like one is fully reductive or fully oxidative. I think one of the things I've done, and a lot of the reason why I've won medals, is most of the styles I won were the reductive styles, in that I did use reasonable amounts of sulfiting, and I was extremely careful to avoid oxidation so that I would keep those fresh aromas and flavors. So, sulfites and sulfides, that's another common confusion for people, because they kind of sound the same. You have sulfites with the letter T, and then sulfides with a letter D. And sulfites are what you would add to help preserve your mead and to protect it from oxidation and also from unwanted infections. Whereas sulfides with a D, those are the ones that are a fault, and those are the ones that can develop if there's stress when the yeast is fermenting, there's not enough nutrition, or if you left it on the leaves too long and you didn't do anything with it. And some of them I call it like a stinky mead, and that's usually from a sulfide. And some of them can be fixed pretty easily, like hydrogen sulfide. If it's not too bad, maybe all you need to do is rack it, or maybe if it's early in fermentation, maybe it just needs a nutrient addition or an oxidation. Later on, maybe just racking it is enough. Dimethyl sulfides and mercaptans are a little bit more tricky to get rid of. There's ways you can do it. They would sometimes pump the wine out in some of these old wineries through like copper pipes, and they didn't know there was actually a reaction with copper and those sulfides. There's a nice product from Scott Labs called Redulus. It has copper in it, but it's made with yeast hulls, so it's very safe. And I've had pretty good success with that product, and it's a lot safer than regular copper. But yeah, sulfites and sulfides they're very different.
Can I jump in with a question real quick, please?
Absolutely. I'm just rambling on. I'm trying to keep on track.
No, you're doing wonderful. I was told, but I don't know why, and that really bothers me, and so I'm asking you, we're not to use copper products during active fermentation, or at least that was my belief. Can you expound on that?
I've heard that too, and actually, copper, if it's too high of an amount, it theoretically could be toxic. And the other thing is that you don't want to be putting that in an acidic beverage, which mead and wine is acidic because you could get too much copper in there. That's a reason why if somebody was having to use it, commercially, that it's tricky to use, and the testing for it and the documentation, because the kind of metal it is, it could cause problems, and it could also cause hazes as well. I think if you have too much copper, it could cause a haze. Maybe that's why they told you not to use it early in fermentation. But I can't remember off the top of my head. I've heard that too, but I don't remember the science for it.
Copper's a reactive metal. You don't want to.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the same reason as you don't want to ferment in aluminum or anything either.
Yeah, that's the same. There's the same way that when people are distilling and they're running a still that's got welds made out of the wrong metal, you can end up poisoning yourself. So, copper's a reactive metal. That's the first thing you learn in cooking. And
Jaden's suggesting that it's the same as an IUD. It kills bacteria, creates a sterile environment, can kill your fermentation. I would assume that has to be a really high concentration, but this is why you don't ferment in a vessel that's not either glass, non-reactive plastic, or stainless steel.
Yeah,
exactly. So we had our beekeeping club a few weeks back, and we brought mead, and I did a honey tasting of varietals, and it was a lot of fun. And so one of the members, she had a mead that did have the dimethyl sulfide flaw. And it was like it was kind of stinky. And I said, "Do you have a copper cup? Do you have a copper spoon?" And so her husband went out in the garage and got a copper wire and cleaned it off. And I made a little whisk of it. And I kind of stirred it in there. And I said, "Okay, now smell it." And it went away. And it was like, "Wow, that's cool." I'm like, science is cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, science is cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard of wine judges getting an old penny. I've not seen this done. Actually, it would be pretty cool. I need to get one of those pennies because it would be a nice little trick at the judging table. But putting an old penny, it can't be a new one, but I think has zinc and other things in there. But getting an old penny and putting it in your glass and swirling it, and then you could, that would prove to you that there's that dimethyl sulfide or mercaptans in there.
I'm pretty sure I had this discussion a couple of years ago on Got Mead with Wayne, and he said anything before about 1982 is a sufficient penny. So I actually do have my winemaking penny that has been scrubbed and gone through the dishwasher and lives in my utility rack.
Since I do have that one that's a little bit sulfided that I need to figure out what to do, it'd be nice to experiment to see if that actually works or if I need to use an older one.
However, the safer way of doing that would be to use, go to Home Depot and get an inch of copper water pipe, and then you can just tie it in and hang it in your mead.
I saw that in an article a few days back, and it was hang a piece of copper pipe right in your fermenter.
I've actually done that once before.
Same here.
So just to clarify for our listeners, the very best thing you can do if you're actively fermenting and you're having problems, I think at some point, depending on your gravity and maybe the phase that the yeast are in, a lot of people think, well, immediately they say, let's throw some nutrients at it. I think that if it's too far gone, that's really not the best answer. In other words, we need to be proactive against this rather than reactive. But initially, early on, if you start to get reductive, the very first thing you need to do is oxygenate the